Chapter 4. The Corroborating Evidence. Is there credible evidence for Jesus outside his biographies? Harry Alleman turned and stabbed his finger at me. "You," he sputtered, spitting out the word with disgust. "Why do you keep writing those things about me?" Then he spun around and disappeared down a back stairwell to escape the reporters who were pursuing him through the courthouse. Actually, it was hard to be a crime reporter in Chicago during the 1970s and not write about Harry Alleman. He was, after all, the quintessential crime syndicate hitman. And Chicagoans, in a perverse way, love to read about the mob. Prosecutors desperately wanted to put Alleman in prison for one of the cold-blooded executions they suspected he had committed on behalf of his syndicate bosses. The problem, of course, was the difficulty of finding anyone willing to testify against a mobster of Alleman's frightening reputation. Then came their big break. One of Alleman's former cronies, Louis Almeida, was arrested on his way to murder a labor official in Pennsylvania. Convicted of weapons charges and sentenced to a decade in prison, Almeida agreed to testify against Alleman in the unsolved slaying of a Teamsters Union shop steward in Chicago, if prosecutors would agree to show leniency toward Almeida. This meant Almeida had a motive to cooperate, which would undoubtedly tarnish his credibility to some degree. Prosecutors realized that they would need to bolster his testimony to ensure a conviction, so they went searching for someone to corroborate Almeida's account. Webster's dictionary defines corroborate this way: to make more certain, confirm. He corroborated my account of the accident. Corroborative evidence supports other testimony. It affirms or backs up the essential elements of an eyewitness account. It can be a public record, a photograph, or additional testimony from a second or third person. It can verify a person's entire testimony or just key parts of it. In effect, corroborative evidence acts like the support wires that keep a tall antenna straight and unwavering. The more corroborative evidence, the stronger and more secure the case. But where would prosecutors find corroboration of Almeida's story? It came from a surprising source. A quiet, law-abiding citizen named Bobby Lowe told investigators he had been walking his dog when he saw Alleman murder the Union steward. Despite Alleman's bone-chilling notoriety, Lowe agreed to back up Almeida's story by testifying against the mobster. At Alleman's trial, Lowe and Almeida mesmerized jurors with their stories. Almeida's account of driving the getaway car dovetailed with Lowe's straightforward description of seeing Alleman murder his victim on a public sidewalk the evening of September 27, 1972. Prosecutors thought they had woven an airtight case against the feared hitman. Yet throughout the trial they sensed something was amiss. Their skepticism first surfaced when Alleman decided against having a jury trial, opting instead to have a judge hear his case. At the end of the trial, the prosecutor's worst suspicions were realized. Despite compelling testimony by Lowe and Almeida, the judge ended up declaring Alleman innocent and letting him go free. What had happened? Remember, this took place in Cook County, Illinois, where corruption so often lurks. Years later, it was revealed that the judge had been slipped $10,000 in return for the acquittal. When an FBI informant disclosed the bribe, the then-retired judge committed suicide, and prosecutors refiled the murder charge against Alleman. By the time the second trial was held, the law had been changed so the prosecutors could demand a jury hear the case. That's what they did. And finally, a full 25 years after the murder, Alleman was found guilty and sentenced to prison, where he later died. In spite of the delays, the Alleman saga shows how significant corroborative evidence can be. And the same is true in dealing with historical issues. We've already heard through Dr. Craig Blomberg's testimony that in the Gospels there is excellent eyewitness evidence for the life teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But is there any other evidence to corroborate that? Are there writings outside the Gospels that affirm or support any of the essentials about Jesus or early Christianity? In other words, is there any additional documentation that can help seal the case for Christ, as Bobby Lowe's testimony sealed the case against Harry Alleman? The answer, according to our next witness, is yes. And the amount and quality of that evidence may very well surprise you. The third interview. Edwin M. Yamauchi, Ph.D. As I entered the imposing brick building that houses the office of Edwin Yamauchi at Miami University in picturesque Oxford, Ohio, I walked underneath a stone arch bearing this inscription: "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free." As one of the country's leading experts in ancient history, Yamauchi has been on a quest for historical truth for much of his life. Born in Hawaii in 1937, the son of immigrants from Okinawa, Yamauchi started from humble beginnings. His father died just before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, leaving his mother to earn a meager living as a maid for wealthy families. While lacking formal education herself, she encouraged her son to read and study, giving him beautifully illustrated books that instilled in him a lifelong love of learning. Certainly his academic accomplishments have been impressive. After earning a bachelor's degree in Hebrew and Hellenistics, Yamauchi received a master's and doctoral degrees in Mediterranean studies from Brandeis University. He has been awarded 8 fellowships from the Rutgers Research Council, National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, and others. He has studied 22 languages, including Arabic, Chinese, Egyptian, Russian, Syriac, Ugaritic, and even Comanche. He has delivered 71 papers before learned societies, lectured at more than 100 seminaries, universities, and colleges, including Yale, Princeton, and Cornell, served as chairman and then president of the Institute for Biblical Research and president of the Conference on Faith and History, and published 80 articles in 37 scholarly journals. In 1968, he participated in the first excavations of the Herodian Temple in Jerusalem, revealing evidence of the temple's destruction in AD 70. Archaeology has also been the theme of several of his books, including The Stones and the Scriptures and Archaeology, and The World of the First Christians. Though born into a Buddhist background, Yamauchi has been following Jesus ever since 1952, the year I was born. I was especially curious to see whether his long-term commitment to Christ would color his assessment of the historical evidence. In other words, would he scrupulously stick to the facts, or be tempted to draw conclusions that went beyond where the evidence warranted? I found Yamauchi to have a gentle and unassuming demeanor. Although generally soft-spoken, he's intensely focused. He provides thorough and detailed answers to questions, often pausing to supplement his verbal response by offering photocopies of scholarly articles he has written on the topic. A good scholar knows you can never have too much data. Inside his book-cluttered office, in the heart of a heavily wooded campus, ablaze in autumn colors, we sat down to talk about the topic that still brings a glint to his eyes, even after so many years of research and teaching. Because of my interview with Blomberg, I didn't want to suggest that we needed to go beyond the Gospels in order to find reliable evidence concerning Jesus. So I started by asking Yamauchi this question. As a historian, could you give me your assessment of the historical reliability of the Gospels themselves? On the whole, the Gospels are excellent sources, he replied. As a matter of fact, they're the most trustworthy, complete, and reliable sources for Jesus. The incidental sources really don't add much detailed information. However, they are valuable as corroborative evidence. Okay, that's what I want to discuss, the corroborative evidence, I said. Let's be honest. Some people scoff at how much there really is. For example, in 1979, Charles Templeton wrote a novel called Act of God, in which a fictional archaeologist made a statement that reflects the beliefs of a lot of people. I pulled out the book and read the relevant paragraph. The Christian church bases its claims mostly on the teachings of an obscure young Jew with messianic pretensions who, let's face it, didn't make much of an impression in his lifetime. There isn't a single word about him in secular history. Not a word. No mention of him by the Romans, not so much as a reference by Josephus. Now, I said a little pointedly, that doesn't sound as if there's much corroboration of the life of Jesus outside the Bible. Yamauchi smiled and shook his head. Templeton's archaeologist is simply mistaken, he replied in a dismissive tone, because we do have very, very important references to Jesus in Josephus and Tacitus. The Gospels themselves say that many who heard him, even members of his own family, did not believe in Jesus during his lifetime. Yet he made such an impression that today Jesus is remembered everywhere, whereas Herod the Great, Pontius Pilate, and other ancient rulers are not as widely known. So he certainly did make an impression on those who believed in him. He paused, then added, he did not, of course, among those who did not believe in him. Templeton and Yamauchi had both mentioned Josephus, a first-century historian who's well known among scholars, but whose name is unfamiliar to most people today. Give me some background about him, I said, and tell me how his testimony provides corroboration concerning Jesus. Yes, of course, Yamauchi answered as he crossed his legs and settled deeper into his chair. Josephus was a very important Jewish historian of the first century. He was born in A.D. 37, and he wrote most of his 4 works toward the end of the first century. In his autobiography, he defended his behavior in the Jewish-Roman War, which took place from A.D. 66 to 74. You see, he had surrendered to the Roman general Vespasian during the siege of Jotapata, even though many of his colleagues committed suicide rather than give up. The professor chuckled and said, Josephus decided it wasn't God's will for him to commit suicide. He then became a defender of the Romans. Josephus sounded like a colorful character. I wanted more details about him so I could better understand his motivations and prejudices. Paint me a portrait of him, I said. He was a priest, a Pharisee, and he was somewhat egotistical. His most ambitious work was called The Antiquities, which was a history of the Jewish people from creation until his time. He probably completed it in about A.D. 93. As you can imagine from his collaboration with the hated Romans, Josephus was extremely disliked by his fellow Jews. But he became very popular among Christians because in his writings he refers to James, the brother of Jesus, and to Jesus himself. Here was our first example of corroboration for Jesus outside the Gospels. Tell me about those references, I said. Replied Yamauchi, in the Antiquities, he describes how a high priest named Ananias took advantage of the death of the Roman governor Festus, who is also mentioned in the New Testament, in order to have James killed. He leaned over to his bookshelf, pulled out a thick volume, and flipped to a page whose location he seemed to know by heart. Here it is, he said. He convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. I know of no scholar, Yamauchi asserted confidently, who has successfully disputed this passage. L.H. Feldman noted that if this had been a later Christian addition to the text, it would have likely been more laudatory of James. So here you have a reference to the brother of Jesus, who had apparently been converted by the appearance of the risen Christ if you compare John 7, verse 5, and 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, and corroboration of the fact that some people consider Jesus to be the Christ, which means the Anointed One, or Messiah. I knew that Josephus had written an even lengthier section about Jesus, which is called Testimonium Flavianum. I knew that this passage was among the most hotly disputed in ancient literature, because on its surface it appears to provide sweeping corroboration of Jesus' life, miracles, death, and resurrection. But is it authentic? Or has it been doctored through the years by people favorable to Jesus? I asked Yamauchi for his opinion, and it was instantly clear I had tapped into an area of high interest for him. He uncrossed his legs and sat up straight in his chair. "This is a fascinating passage," he said with enthusiasm, leaning forward, book in hand. "But yes, it is controversial." With that, he read it to me. "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." The wealth of corroboration for Jesus was readily evident. "You agreed this was controversial. What have scholars concluded about this passage?" I asked. "Scholarship has gone through 3 trends about it," he said. "For obvious reasons, the early Christians thought it was a wonderful and thoroughly authentic attestation of Jesus and his resurrection. They loved it. Then the entire passage was questioned by at least some scholars during the Enlightenment. But today, there's a remarkable consensus among both Jewish and Christian scholars that the passage as a whole is authentic, although there might have been some interpolations." I raised an eyebrow. "Interpolations? Would you define what you mean by that?" "That means early Christian copyists inserted some phrases that a Jewish writer like Josephus would not have written," Yamauchi said. He pointed to a sentence in the book. For instance, the first line says, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man." That phrase is not normally used of Jesus by Christians, so it seems authentic for Josephus. But the next phrase says, "If indeed one ought to call him a man." This implies Jesus was more than human, which appears to be an interpolation. I nodded to let him know I was following him so far. It goes on to say, "For he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks." That seems to be quite in accord with the vocabulary Josephus uses elsewhere, and is generally considered authentic. But then there's this unambiguous statement: "He was the Christ." That seems to be an interpolation. Because, I interrupted, Josephus says in his reference to James that Jesus was called the Christ. "That's right," said Yamauchi. "It's unlikely Josephus would have flatly said Jesus was the Messiah here, when elsewhere he merely said he was considered to be the Messiah by his followers." The next part of the passage, which talks about Jesus' trial and crucifixion, and the fact that his followers still loved him, is unexceptional and considered genuine. Then there's this phrase, "On the third day he appeared to them restored to life." Again, this is a clear declaration of belief in the resurrection, and thus it's unlikely that Josephus wrote it. So these 3 elements seem to have been interpolations. What's the bottom line, I asked? That this passage in Josephus probably was originally written about Jesus, although without those 3 points I mentioned. But even so, Josephus corroborates important information about Jesus: that he was the martyred leader of the church in Jerusalem, and that he was a wise teacher who had established a wide and lasting following, despite the fact that he had been crucified under Pilate at the instigation of some of the Jewish leaders. While these references did offer some important independent verification about Jesus, I wondered why a historian like Josephus wouldn't have said more about such an important figure of the first century. I knew that some skeptics, like Boston University philosopher Michael Martin, have made this same critique. So I asked for Yamauchi's reaction to this statement by Martin, who doesn't believe Jesus ever lived. If Jesus did exist, one would have expected Josephus to have said more about him. It is unexpected that Josephus mentioned him in passing while mentioning other messianic figures and John the Baptist in greater detail. Yamauchi's response seemed uncharacteristically strong. From time to time, some people have tried to deny the existence of Jesus, but this is really a lost cause, he said, with a tone of exasperation. There is overwhelming evidence that Jesus did exist, and these hypothetical questions are really very vacuous and fallacious. But I'd answer by saying this. Josephus was interested in political matters and the struggle against Rome. So for him, John the Baptist was more important because he seemed to pose a greater political threat than did Jesus. I jumped in. Hold on a second. Aren't there some scholars who have portrayed Jesus as a zealot, or at least sympathetic to the zealots, I asked, referring to a first-century revolutionary group that opposed Rome politically? Yamauchi dismissed the objection with a wave of his hand. That is a position the Gospels themselves do not support, he replied, because remember, Jesus didn't even object to paying taxes to the Romans. Therefore, because Jesus and his followers didn't pose an immediate political threat, it's certainly understandable that Josephus isn't more interested in this sect, even though in hindsight it turned out to be very important indeed. So,